If we were playing Yahtzee, I would have been doing great on sixes, but we were not playing Yahtzee, and it hurt.
Are you ready for this year's coverage of the Axis and Allies World Championship? Today we're starting with a side tournament from that event. Time to take your seat at the table for the 2024 Axis and Allies 1942 Second Edition Tournament Final. Let's make it hot. Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. In 2023, Renegade Game Studios sponsored the very first Axis and Allies World Championship at Gen Con in Indianapolis. Specifically, the game in question was 1942 Second Edition. My teammate Doug Thorpe and I were thrilled to take home that very first title. This Axis and Allies event at Gen Con has been organized by the incomparable Greg Smorey for the past 30 plus years and features tournaments in a wide variety of A&A games. In 2024, though, the anniversary edition took center stage as the World Championship event, and we'll be bringing you 4 games from that amazing tournament soon. But today we're excited to share with you the final from the 1942 Second Edition tournament. This battle between a couple of seasoned players and some young guns out of New Orleans has a bunch of surprises in it that we can't wait to share. First, some context. This year, I opted not to play in any of the events. Instead, Board Game Nation brought a production team to capture the action of loads of Axis and Allies events and more, with the goal of bringing more of these videos to you that were so popular last year. But if this is your first time here, welcome. Here's how this works. While the shortest Axis and Allies games can be hours long, and even as much as I love this game, watching raw gameplay video is like watching paint dry slowly. So what my team and I have done is record every detail of our featured games. Then we rebuild those games in the studio and take still images that make the game much more easy to follow. Today, Doug and I are going to give you a full battle report of the 1942 Second Edition final, discuss some strategic and tactical options, and try to have some fun along the way. Plus, we are thrilled to welcome 2 of the players from this final match to join us in our conversation today. This should be a lot of fun. You might have noticed a few items behind me that are signed by the man himself, the creator of Axis and Allies and many other fantastic games, Mr. Larry Harris. In 2024, we launched Board Game Nation memberships. To celebrate, we gave away a pile of amazing gifts, and behind me are just a few of the items that we still have in store for future giveaways. Thank you to all of our charter members for being with us at the beginning. Our live streams are back. Doug and I are going to be going live from Board Game Nation Studios on the Friday following the release of this video to share our thoughts and answer community questions about this game and really anything Axis and Allies related. We hope to see you there. But if you can't make it, that's okay. That conversation will be available at BoardGameNation.com shortly after it wraps up. Now it's time for the Choose Your Own Adventure portion of the show. If this is your first time here and you've never played in an Axis and Allies tournament before, please keep your seats and hang out for just a moment. We've got some important information that's going to make this whole thing make a bit more sense. If you have seen our show before and you're ready to jump into the action, head over to this timestamp right here to get into the battle. Let's talk tournament play. With some minor variations, casual play and online play have basically the same rules, but because tournaments have lots of players and a limited amount of time, the rules for tournament play have some significant differences. Today we're going to be looking at tournament play for the 1942 Second Edition game, and there are 3 big rules differences that you need to know. Number 1, players bid for sides. Rather than a random draw, if both players wish to play the same side, they'll start a bidding process that, when completed, may allow players to place additional units on the map prior to the start of the game. Now, a good bid and the placement of those units can make a huge difference in a game. A while back, we made a video that lays out all of the rules for bidding, and if you want to know more about it, you can follow this link right here. Number 2, in tournament play, the Larry Harris Gen Con 3.0 setup is used rather than the out-of-the-box setup. The 3.0 setup adds some additional UK units and relocates or removes some German units to create a better gameplay experience. We also made a video about that, and here's that link. Lastly, and most importantly, number 3. Tournament games have a very specific time limit and win conditions. In the case of 1942.2, the game ends at the end of 5 hours of play. If a side has achieved a standard victory in the time allowed, that's plus 3 victory cities from what they started with, they win. If that hasn't happened when the time expires, the team with the most victory cities wins. So as you can imagine, that changes the strategies quite a bit. Now, that isn't to say that tournament strategies won't work in casual or online play, but their target is a bit different. The time limit shifts the goal to controlling more victory cities than your opponent when the time expires, rather than trying to hold 9 or 10 cities. In 1942.2, that means controlling 7 or more when the clock runs out. This rule set lends itself to a much more aggressive style of play and can be a ton of fun. Just something to keep in mind as you follow the action. A quick disclaimer. Now, I did my best to recreate the games as accurately as possible, but things happen in the heat of a game and during the recreation process that may have caused some of the minor details to get lost. Still, I'm confident that any minor discrepancies wouldn't have made any significant difference to the outcome of any of the games that we're going to cover in this series. Also, in the pictures, you're going to see the different colored chips offset like this. This was done intentionally to make them easier to see for the camera, but in reality, they stack just fine. All right, that's enough for now. You'll pick up the rest along the way. Let's get into the action. All right, it's time to dive into the game. Of course, I can't do this without my fellow 2023 world champion, Mr. Doug Thorpe. Please welcome him.
Hey, Gary, good to be here as always.
Doug, thanks again for taking the time. Can't wait to dive into this game. But before we do that, we've got to welcome a couple of guests from New Orleans, two young guys that came and played in this tournament, very first tournament they'd ever played in. So let's welcome Alex and Owen.
Thank you for having us. Excited to be here.
We're very excited to be a part of this.
Awesome. All right, so let's dive into the game here. We've got a couple of really interesting things that happened in this game that we need to talk about, that we need to cover, because I am confused by a couple of things that happened in this game, and I'm hoping that you can clear some of that stuff up for me. Again, we're playing 1942 Second Edition, and this game is settled by a bid. And I should remind our viewers, if you haven't seen our videos from last year's tournament, when Doug and I played in the 2023 1942 Second Edition tournament, the average bid in that game was +6 to the Allies, which means that the players in that tournament believed that the game was skewed in the favor of the Axis. So much so that the Allies should be given an additional 6 IPCs worth of material to put on the board before the game begins. However, this one went a bit differently, and I'm wondering if Alex or Owen, whichever one of you wants to talk about what your strategy was going into this bid and how it turned out.
What we had seen previously in, the 3 games before this was that the Allies were winning everything. I think the Allies won the entire first round. There was only one Axis winner in the second round. The bids had been heavily skewed toward the Axis. I think the largest we had seen was Axis +3 or +4. So a lot of the bids were going that way. Simply put, from y'all's videos last year, the Thorpe Thump had become kind of the meta, and it was very hard for people to stop it. It was winning most games. There was not really a chance for people to stop it, and it was dominating.
Yeah, actually, when I was at the tournament, I walked around in the earlier rounds of the 1942 Second Edition tournament, and as I walked around, I could see that a bunch of the games were using the Thorpe Thump. In fact, I walked up to Doug, who was playing in the anniversary tournament, the World Championship tournament, and said, "Hey, man, I think the word's out because everyone is playing the Thorpe Thump, and I'll be interested to see what counter strategies are developed for it." So I think we might see some of that here today. Let's find out. So I think the bid ended up towards the Axis. Again, first time I've seen that. Axis +5, which is an awkward number because infantries are worth 3, artilleries are worth 4, AA guns, which aren't usually as effective, are worth 5, and then everything else is worth 6 or more. And the rules state that you can only use the total IPCs that are made available to you. You don't have to use all of them, so they could have elected to use 3 or 4 and put them in different places, or they could use all 5. They elected, which I think is a really interesting choice, to place an AA gun into Ukraine. Now, this is a really juicy spot that Russians will attack on the very first turn. So it's interesting to see them try to defend this here. Russia has 2 fighters that they're likely to send in to this territory on the first turn. I'm curious, guys, you want to tell me what you were thinking here?
They're going to send 2 fighters in. We knew the 912 is typically the opening move. We had been playing the Allies up until this point. That's what we would have done. So we got the +5. We thought about putting the artillery there, but I kind of thought about it, and the artillery is going to get 1 roll at a 2 or less to get a hit, right? After that, more than likely, it's going to be sacrificed on that first turn. So why not give yourself 2 dice, even if it's a 1? Giving yourself those 2 dice gives yourself a better chance, and you can take that artillery or the anti-air gun, you can take that as a casualty. So it actually gives you one extra roll, granted at a lower number, but it gives you that one extra roll and still lets you take that as a casualty when they are hitting you.
Yeah, the minute he put that down, I walked away. I couldn't watch it. I couldn't watch it happen.
I
like
it, fellas. I like it.
Oh, you.
Yeah, that's funny, Doug. I was actually just going to ask you, what did you think of that placement, and what would you do with 5 IPCs for the Axis in this situation?
I think this is a really interesting idea. I like it. I don't know it would have been the first thing I would have went to. I think the first thing I would have probably went to would have been an artillery in Libya in order to attack Egypt. Just because if you could take out the Egyptians there, particularly that fighter, you could potentially set the UK back considerably and prevent an attack against C Zone 57. So yeah, but I like it. I think it's a novel idea. I do like the idea that yeah, you can take it as a casualty and it gets those 2 shots, and if you hit one of those, oh baby. So I like it.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar to that as well, the artillery in Libya. But if you're anticipating the Thorpe thump here, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a full on attack on Japan with a big emphasis on the U.S. Navy and the fleet, and then trying to capture Manila and Shanghai as the victory cities that you're going to need to win. So if that's the anticipated strategy, I might have put an artillery into Manchuria to help clear up Buryatia or Anhui. Or if I was feeling particularly froggy, I might have dropped the artillery into Kwangtung to be able to take a swing at the American fighter in Sichuan. But the AA gun in Ukraine is absolutely a valid choice, and I think that it does some good things for you. At Board Game Nation, we work to foster an environment where gamers and enthusiasts of all stripes feel welcome. That's why when BetterHelp reached out to be the sponsor of this video, I knew it was a no-brainer. BetterHelp creates a safe and convenient space for you to talk to a therapist from the comfort of your, well, just about anywhere. BetterHelp will match you with a licensed therapist based on your therapy needs. If you don't feel your therapist is the right fit, no worries. You can switch therapists at any time to find a provider that's a good match for you. Some unique features of BetterHelp that I really like are the therapist chat functions, group therapy that targets specific needs, and their online journal. They even have therapists that specialize in working with veterans. Now, when it comes to seeking this kind of help, a big hurdle so many of us face is cost. BetterHelp is already an affordable online solution, but BGN would also like to help. If you think you could benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or the pinned comment, or visit betterhelp.com/BoardGameNation to get 10% off your first month of therapy. All right, back to the game. Let's look at what Russia actually did. And so now we've got the AA gun placed in Ukraine. And we can look at what they purchased. They bought 4 infantry and 3 artillery. I will say this is pretty standard play when you look at online play. But I don't love this for tournament play simply because it's not aggressive enough. And I'm a big proponent of the notion that that a tournament play has to be aggressive play. So I prefer a fighter here over the artillery. Basically, my preferred purchase here is 4 infantry and a fighter. Saves 2 IPCs to kind of play with on the second turn to give you a chance to react and see what's happening there. But this is not, again, this is pretty standard play. And as you mentioned before, they did go with what's called a standard 9-12 attack. That's 12 units into West Russia, and then everything else that can reach goes into Ukraine. That's another 9. That's the 9-12 attack. And they sent the 2 fighters into to Ukraine. Okay, so when the Russians make this attack here, they're pretty heavily favored to win. Without the AA gun there, they're at a 92% chance to win this battle outright. So they're pretty heavily favored to win here. But when you add the AA gun, that amount does drop down to 75% favored to win here. But it did not work out that well for them because they hit with their magic AA gun on the first turn, which was remarkable.
We were jumping up and down the minute this happened. Like I said, I walked away, and all I heard was Alex go, "It hit." And we were so excited about it because the odds of it are.
Yeah, I have it at 30.5%, 30.55 repeating is what I came up with, which is pretty stinking good if you think about it.
So needless to say, the AA gun paid off. They were not favored to hit it, but of course, the odds. This is why we roll the dice. So that's how that worked out. So that's good. So as they got into combat, of course, now the math has changed dramatically, and it did not go well for them. Ukraine actually holds with one fighter remaining, and then the Russians retreated with one fighter. They did have better luck in West Russia. They did take that with 7 infantry remaining, along with the 2 artillery and the tank. So total losses in Russia's first combat round, Russia loses 47 IPCs worth of material, and the Germans lose 55.
That's very good for Germany because, I mean, even if you just trade out the 2 fighters, Germany loses their fighter, Russia doesn't lose their fighter. That's a 20-point swing. But usually Russia takes that with a couple ground units, so that's huge.
Yeah, normally you see 2 or 3 tanks remaining here, along with 2 fighters remaining. Looking at the Russian non-combat move, they consolidate in Buryatia and then send a couple guys back to Archangel. The guy in Kazakh, they, instead of moving him to Szechuan, which is kind of the more standard move here, they move him back to Caucasus to make up for the terrible losses that they just suffered in Ukraine. Oh, and of course the sub moves over from 4 to join the fleet in Sea Zone 7. So that is their non-combat move. They need to mobilize their units. They put 3 infantry and the artillery into Caucasus, and then the remainder, the 1 guy and the 2 artillery, into Russia. I will say that a fighter now in Caucasus would have been, superior to just the artillery there, but we'll see what the future brings. That is the end of Russia's first turn. Over to the Germans. So this is your board state at the beginning of the Germans' turn here. What is your thinking when this game gets started? When the game gets started for you?
We knew again that the Thorpe thump had been prevalent. That had been the majority of what people had been doing. Number 1 was we have to get rid of the transports in the Atlantic. Are they going to be a problem for Germany? Probably not, based off of what we had seen. But the less transports America has, the better off that the Axis are as a whole, regardless of where they take them. So that was number 1 priority. Obviously, there is the fleet in the northern Atlantic, just off the coast of Britain, that we want to take care of. And then really, it's just trying to expand Germany wherever we can, trying to break into Africa. We held on to Ukraine, so we did not have to worry about taking that back, but trying to push, poke a little bit at where we could, trying to find those soft spots without giving away too much. I think really going into this turn, the majority of what I was worried about was the ocean compared to the land.
So you started by purchasing 9 infantry and a bomber. I was curious, why so many infantry? That seemed like a lot of infantry.
The reasoning is that typically these games last about 5 turns, maybe 6. If you buy that stack of infantry, by turn 4, you're able to get that infantry into Moscow. So it's kind of, you're not ever going to be able to get that infantry stack other than on turn 1. If you buy it on turn 2, turn 3, you're doing it defensively, not offensively. So this was a way to get us cannon fodder to start moving it towards the front and not have to worry about, yes, we're going to take Karelia, and yes, we're going to be able to put 2 guys there, right? But 2 guys doesn't really swing the battle that much. So buying that large stack of infantry and just slowly moving it towards that front line where Russia can see it coming, but trying to just combat and we're never going to be able to equal their infantry, but trying to get as much as we can there for cannon fodder for the bomber, for our tanks, for any fighters that we have remaining. It just, the math works out that it can reach there by turn 5 and would give us a play at Moscow on turn 5.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is the beginning of what's commonly referred to as the Black Wave. So you'd have infantry in round 1, tanks in round 2, tanks in round 3, fighters in round 4, bombers in round 5, or some combination thereof, with the idea that it would all land in Moscow on 5 or 6. So yeah, this is a popular strategy, and I appreciate that. So let's look at your combat moves here. You decided to make a big stack in Karelia on turn 1. You went a little lighter than normal in Sea Zone 7, sending a sub and a cruiser and 2 fighters from Europe. over to try to sweep those guys out there. You've got a 67% odds to take this here. And then over into C-Zone 11, you went after the American Transports and the Destroyer with both subs out of C-Zone 9. This gives you an odds of success here of 87%, which is pretty good, up from 36%, I think it is, when you only send one. So if you really wanted those American transports taken out, then this is absolutely the way to do it. And if you believe that these are going to make the transit through the Panama Canal and be supportive of the attack on Japan, then this is absolutely a solid choice here. So these are, and you also made a push at Transjordan, sending the battleship and the transport with the artillery from Southern Europe and the infantry from Italy into 17 with the hopes of clearing the destroyer that's there and landing in Transjordan. So let's see how it worked out. You were successful in clearing the destroyer and taking the Transjordan. You sank the destroyer and the 2 transports in C-Zone 11. Not so good in C-Zone 7.
Did not go well.
Yeah, this was a little bleak for the Germans in this particular battle.
I was watching him, and every single time he rolled, it gave me a heart attack.
If we were playing Yahtzee, I would have been doing great on 6s, but we were not playing Yahtzee, and it hurt.
You destroyed the submarine that was there and did score a mighty hit on the battleship, but unfortunately lost everything except for the fighter that is retreating. So that is that's going to be tough because now the British have got 2 transports that are still there in play, so we're going to have to keep an eye on those. Of course, we stepped into Karelia with no problem. You're there now with 8 infantry and 4 tanks. So as we look at the losses for Germany's first turn, the Allies lose 39, the Axis lose 28. I know this is going to sound crazy, but this is a reasonable outcome actually for the Allies here because they were able to maintain the battleship, they were able to maintain the destroyer. The cruiser N13 is still there, and so they've got 2 transports there and 2 ships that can do offshore bombardments. So they've got a lot of options here now in the Atlantic that they don't normally have. Yes, the Allies did lose the destroyer and the 2 transports that were there, and of course the destroyer that was in the Med. But the big news out of this particular round of combat is the survival of the battleship and the 2 transports in the Atlantic. On to non-combat, they consolidate over into Libya. They leave the guy in Morocco, which I think is an interesting choice. Normally I see that guy walk over to Algeria, but it's not, make or break for sure. They consolidate into the Baltic states, but then also drop a couple of speed bombs across Central and Eastern Europe. And then they also land the lucky surviving fighter from the battle in C-Zone 7 over into Finland with a couple of guys. So one thing that I do want to note here that I try to encourage everybody to remember when you're playing Germany, particularly in this version of the game. And in other versions, you'd be playing the Italians. But in Italy, if you've got a transport in the Med, you're going to always want to have something for that transport to move. So there's an AA gun there in Italy now, which isn't, of course, an offensive piece. But if you can leave a guy there with even if it's just 2 guys, or a guy and a tank and a guy and an artillery or whatever, it gives you a lot more options. But other than that, I was very happy with the rest of how all this played out. This made perfect sense to me. When it came time to mobilize, we've got the 9 infantry and the bomber. They all went into Germany. Again, 2 of those guys could have landed in Italy here and given you some options there. But when you put it all together, it all looks pretty good. And as we look across all of Germany's first turn, Doug, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think a pretty good round for Germany. I think it's interesting. You guys really moved out of France, giving them the opportunity with 2 transports to move in there. I like that play because I think that it at least prevents the future opportunity. We'll see what the UK does of going in there and maybe losing some land troops. So yeah, I think it was a good round. I would have moved the AA gun out of Italy into Germany or something. I don't know that it's doing anything in Italy. There's not really any threats coming anytime soon. But yeah, I think it's a great round. I like where your stuff is at.
UK. Time to purchase their units. They buy a carrier, they buy a destroyer, and they buy 3 infantry. So let's look at their combat. They use one of their transports, the one in Sea Zone 7, to come down, bring a guy and an artillery and a fighter to try to take out the 2 guys and land in France. They do get the offshore shots with the battleship and the cruiser. They try to take Transjordan back with Persia, with the guy from Persia, the artillery, and the tank coming out of Egypt. And they go for a full-on attack on Sea Zone 37. That's 2 cruisers, an aircraft carrier, 2 fighters, and the sub versus a battleship, a carrier, and 2 fighters. They're favored to win this battle by 64%. And then they do my favorite, which is the double Dutch, taking 2 guys from India with the transport there to drop into Borneo, and then the 2 infantry from Eastern Australia up to land in New Guinea. So your favorites to win in those, the fighter came off the UK and to take out the lone undefended transport in Sea Zone 5. And the destroyer from Sea Zone 10 went into 11 with the help of the bomber to take out the 2 subs in Sea Zone 11. Let's see how it worked out for them. They failed to take France. This is a pretty strong statistical improbability. They had a guy and an artillery versus 2 guys, and the 2 guys are dead. And the 2 infantry, the 2 German infantry in France have also been destroyed. So they don't get to take the territory because they don't have a land unit left. And they do evacuate with their fighter. And they were successful, of course, in both of those instances. But the destroyer in Sea Zone 11 did get destroyed by the defending subs, which is also remarkable because subs only defend on a 1. So this is pretty good rolls for the Germans here. And the UK also failed to take Transjordan, and they were favored in this battle. They had a guy and a tank and an artillery, and they don't have any of that left. The unit still standing in Transjordan is the German artillery. So some pretty tough dice, but they make up for it on this side a little bit here. They are successful in taking Borneo and New Guinea, something Doug and I were never able to do in, in last year's tournament.
Not once.
No,
It's
one
so
time.
frustrating.
Oh my god! But the battle in Sea Zone 37 has an interesting outcome. The battleship and the aircraft carrier for the Japanese are both destroyed at the same time as the last of the UK units are destroyed. So there's a lot of hardware at the bottom of Sea Zone 37, but the 2 fighters are able to evacuate the sea zone and land in the East Indies instead of crashing. So there's 2 fighters there that the Japanese are not really accustomed to having. Usually those are destroyed in that attack. So they've got a little bit of a head start here, but they are down Borneo and New Guinea. Total losses in this one. This was an expensive battle for everybody. The UK alone lost 98 IPCs, which is a ton. Holy cow. And the Axis lost 68 IPCs worth of material. I would be curious, gentlemen, as you saw the UK's opening, what were your thoughts?
Well, for Japan, I mean, I was caught off guard. I've never had 2 fighters survive that at all. And so it kind of 100% shifted in what I wanted to do in the game after we saw that.
At this exact moment, it was very hard to determine until America's turn, what are they doing, right? Are they going to go for that European front? Are they going to continue with what we thought they were going to do? Like, it kind of confused me a little bit, and it was kind of one of those moments where, well, we have these 2 fighters. Japan is coming out great. We know what we want to do with Japan. We have to wait and see what America is going to do because that's going to kind of decide the rest of the flow of the game.
It is a little unclear with the heavy investment in the Atlantic. It does look like the Allies are going Atlantic at this point. They're playing defensive in India. They're just going to stack men, and then they're going to put fleet and go after Germany is probably what I would assume at this point in the game.
Well, for non-combat, both of the fighters made it back into Sea Zone 8, which tells us that that's where the carrier now is obligated to land. They left the transport out in Sea Zone 10, walked the guy over from Western Canada into Eastern Canada, which is going to make that transport fully loaded. They dropped the bomber in Eastern Canada and then they marched the guy south from Egypt to get him immediately out of harm's way, and then moved up to the Belgian Congo. And in the subcontinent, they did take one of the guys out of India and walked him over to Persia. And in the Pacific, everything that could move did move, so they're all pretty well locked in. They mobilized their new units. They put the 3 infantry in India. They put the carrier and the destroyer into Sea Zone 8, which takes us to Japan 1. Tell us what you're thinking here.
Well, the thought process is they're going the Atlantic. So my whole thought process was I'm just gonna go aggressive and I'm gonna go straight for India. And if their fleet does leave, then I'm gonna go for Hawaii and just start taking extra stuff all around. Because at this point they've given me so much freedom, especially with the 2 fighters I have extra. I can now basically use those to attack anywhere I want.
So you started with a purchase of a bomber, 1 transport, a tank, and an infantry. For combat moves, you decided to clear the decks in Buryatia. You brought one of the transports, the transport from 60 with the battleship into 62 to do the offshore shot, along with the fighter and the bomber from Japan, plus the 3 infantry and the fighter from Manchuria, making the march north. In Anhui, you sent the 4 infantry over from Kiangsu, along with the fighter up from French Indochina, Thailand. And you moved into Yunnan with the 3 infantry, the artillery, and the 2 guys from Kwangtung.
We were very surprised that they stacked the Russian infantry in Buryatia. Like on Russia 1, we saw them stack in Buryatia. I remember I turned to him and I said, "You're going to blow that up, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, absolutely."
Yeah, I agree. I think putting them there really exposes them. I feel like it's a little bit like you were talking about France earlier. If you put them there and Japan goes in strong, you do have a chance to get rid of some of Japan's land forces and it pulls them north, which I'd generally rather Japan spend their time going north than south. So for that reason, it can be tempting, but I think you're often better off having the Russians start moving south in later rounds and having a bigger force there. So I don't love putting them on the coast either. Um, even though I'm a little split 50-50 whether Japan should attack them on round 1 or not. I think I slightly lean away from an attack on round 1, come in later and clean them out. But either way, it's yeah, I don't like putting them on the coast. I think you need to save those Russian guys for later in the game.
Well, our thought process was here is we get to wipe out 7 Russians, and then I can just start taking resources in the back line slowly, right? And the other side of it, I now have a cruiser. I'm pretty sure a cruiser and a battleship that can do shore bombardment. My fighter and my bomber can reach that. I have a ton of guys that can now go to it and slowly start putting pressure, depending on what survives, into Russia now. And now they have to either pivot guys backwards to go, which then helps out Germany. And the other thought process is I don't think America's coming for me. I don't think I'm going to need these guys because the next couple of turns, I'm hoping I'm just going to be building transports and infantry and guys to just go basically take all the victory points everywhere. That's my thought process right there, which is why we wanted to wipe that out so that we don't have to deal with it later. So there's slowly 7 guys are slowly going down our back line, and then they take that 1 victory point, which then loses us the game because we forgot about them.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely understand where you're coming from. A couple of thoughts. One of the tactics for a Kill Japan first game is to stack heavy in Buryatia like this, and then land American fighters there on their turn, so they can get the fighter from the carrier in 53. If it survives a potential Pearl Harbor, it can land in Buryatia. So which makes that a lot harder to take in future turns. So if you see a stack land in Buryatia, that is a pretty good indication that they are probably planning to come heavy into the Pacific. Otherwise, that stack, you're right, would go into Yakut and then start marching to the west. So taking this out here is not a bad idea. I would be nervous about falling behind in the tempo because you've said that you wanted to go after India. So, but you're going to be in Japan too. You're going to be there with a couple of transports and in a consolidated fleet, plus these 2 extra fighters that are going to have to come up from the East Indies. So you've got a couple of interesting options here. The one thing that I would say here is that the tank in Japan isn't doing you any good. So if your goal was to clear off Buryatia and then run across the Siberia, the Great White North of Russia, the tank is going to be the better tool for that. Instead of having to walk to the Soviet Far East and then to Yakut and then to Venki, your tank can get you around that corner much more quickly, twice as fast because it moves two instead of one. So that is one thing that I would have done differently. The other thing here is if I've got a choice between taking out the 5 or 7 or however many infantry are in Buryatia or killing the American fighter in Sichuan, I'm going to take that fighter out every single time because that fighter is to me is a much larger threat. It makes India much harder to take, and it gives an offensive punch in a couple of places that you don't necessarily want them to have, particularly if you think that the Americans have the potential of coming at you in the Pacific. But I do like the idea of eliminating a power from this theater entirely. And by taking out the Russian unit, that is one thing that you've been able to do here. But the Russians can come back. They can build guys and tanks that can come into your theater again. Once you take out all of the Americans in China, it is virtually impossible for them to come back. What you guys did here makes perfect sense to me. I completely understand why you did it, and it certainly has its benefits. So let's what else do we have? So we consolidated the fleet around 47, taking out the transport, and we sent the 2 fighters from the East Indies into Borneo. They will then land on that carrier when the time comes, with a guy and with the infantry and the artillery from the Philippines have come down to Borneo to try to liberate that. The sub is going to take out the undefended transport in 49. So how did it turn out? All of the air units survived in Buryatia, as well as 2 infantry and the artillery. Moving down to Anhui, you lost 2 infantry there, but took out the 2 that were in Anhui. In Yunnan, you've got 2 infantry, 2 artillery, and a fighter left. And down here, we traded infantry. The Japanese infantry was lost, but they did take out the UK infantry. So pretty good round all in. Pretty average dice, I would say, for this one. So when we look at Japan ones, by the numbers, we've got the Allies losing 44 big IPCs in this round, and the Axis losing just the 12. That's the 4 infantry. So a pretty good round, a pretty good opener for Japan. You gotta like it. You gotta like it. For non-combat, the air unit, the bomber, heads back to Buryatia. The fighters land in Kiangsu. The guy steps up from Malaya. 2 fighters land there in the FIT, or the French Indochina Thailand. And of course, the 2 fighters land in 47 on the carrier that is there. Looking across the entire Pacific theater, it looks like Japan is in pretty good shape. They've got a well-defended 62, and then the fleet in 47 seems to be in pretty good shape. They don't have much in the way of threats. India doesn't have any air units in it. In fact, there are no UK air units in this theater at all. The Americans they're in their starting positions still, of course, because they haven't had a turn. But they don't have a place to land if they wanted to try to come at anything, because Buryatia is now under the flag of the rising sun. So they are in pretty good shape. They're going to mobilize their fleet. Of course, they can only mobilize in Tokyo. The bomber, the tank, the infantry, and the transport all land in there. The transport, of course, into 62 with the rest of the fleet. They've got 2 transports there and 4 infantry and 2 tanks. So not optimal, but certainly respectable. So on to the Americans. They start the game with a bomber, 2 destroyers, and a carrier. For combat moves, before we move any further, we have a correction. In Yunnan, we had everything coming from Kwangtung into Yunnan. That was not, this was an error in my recreation of it. They did leave 1 guy in Kwangtung instead of sending everybody in there, but the math stayed the same. The outcome was the same. They just had an extra guy in the wrong place. He belongs in Kwangtung. So now as we look at their combat moves, this is why it became important, because Sichuan did attack Kwangtung with 2 infantry and a fighter against the 1 guy. They also jumped out to Iwo Jima. So they came out with the battleship, they came out with the transport and 2 guys, and the fighter from the carrier in 53 to try to take hold and ownership of Iwo Jima. And that's all their combat for the first turn. Not particularly surprising. The U.S. doesn't have a lot usually going in the first turn. So how did the combat turn out? They were successful in taking Iwo Jima and taking no losses. So they've got 2 infantry there, and the fighter is on the island, but it's got 1 move, which is going to obligate that carrier to move out. They were not successful in Kwangtung. The 2 infantry bit the dust, but they did take out the Japanese infantry that was there, but they were unable to take the territory because they don't have a land unit left to take the territory. And this is a really key point here. That was the last American land unit in Europe or Asia. So they will not be able to capture any land territories unless the Americans are able to bring additional units in this direction. I do not like this move for the Americans.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't like a lot of what the Allies are doing with America now. Like honestly, other than the move to Iwo, I'm still not sure if they're going KGF or KJF, and you effectively wasting your last 2 guys in Asia. Even if you capture it with 2 infantry, they're just going to get annihilated. So what does that really gain you? I think it's confusing, 2 confusing combat moves, and I'm not really even sure that I'm a big fan of the purchase. It seems like you lost transports off of the East Coast, and you're not building up a defensive enough navy. Your bombers can always get into the game later. I don't really love the even the purchase from America in this round.
It's crazy how it affects this side of the map, right? But by buying the anti-aircraft and winning so convincingly in Ukraine, they weren't able to move their infantry into China to then maybe take like it actually ended up helping Japan by putting that anti-air gun in Ukraine. Like
You're right, it was genius.
it worked out. It worked out.
It was the move of the game.
It's like the butterfly effect.
It's the butterfly effect. Like it's one of those smaller things like that just kind
They
of
should
ended
have
up
resigned after you
affecting-
put that AA gun down.
They should have. I don't know why they didn't.
Craziness. Okay, so that's how the Americans' combat turned out. Pretty light on the casualty this time. 6 for each side. 2 American infantry, 2 Japanese infantry. Non-combat, they vacated the eastern United States, moving across to the eastern side. The fighter from Kwangtung did have enough movements to get them over to India. They consolidated the fleet around Iwo Jima into Sea Zone 59, and the bomber from the eastern United States landed on Midway Island. The fighter comes up from the eastern United States, lands in 56, which is going to obligate the carrier to land there. And then, of course, the tank moved over. And this cruiser in 56 came up from Sea Zone 19. And this is one of those kind of magic tells that you can find from different players. If that cruiser in 19 comes to the west versus the east, that is almost always a tell as to which theater the side is going to focus on.
Yeah, we saw that happening, and the panic in our eyes of, oh, they're not going for the Atlantic, here comes America, was immediate. Because, I mean, if you're just looking at that right there, the Japanese fleet's completely separated, and you also have a full entire American fleet just at your doorstep. That is just, I've never seen someone move towards Iwo Jima as America in the first move.
All I can say is I'm glad we hedged our bets. Kind of played a little bit defensively on both.
Yeah, I will say the only thing that I felt like was a miss here from the Americans in the non-combat move here was the fighter on the Hawaiian Islands. Seems like it should have moved back to 56 to land on the carrier that's coming in, but they didn't do that. So moving on, they need to mobilize here. They've got the bomber, 2 destroyers, and the carrier. It all comes into San Francisco, the bomber in western United States, the carrier, and the 2 destroyers. After they put it all together, they've got a pretty reasonable hold there in the middle of the Pacific. It would be very difficult to dislodge them at this point. And they do have the 2 infantry standing on the island of Iwo Jima and 1 transport in the entire theater, which is a dangerous place for the Americans to be. As we look around on at the end of round 1 here, we end up with the Americans clearly have sunk every single IPC and piece of material into the Pacific theater, and they think that they can dominate there. We think that that's true because they really haven't spent any significant resources from any of the other Allied powers to help in the Pacific theater. The UK seems focused in the European theater. As we're moving around too, the Russians, for their purchase, they start with 6 infantry and 2 artillery. For their combat, they make a light push into Belarusia and into Ukraine. An infantry and an artillery and a fighter into Belarusia, and then 2 infantry and an artillery into Ukraine. And that is all of their combat. Let's see how it worked out for them. They were successful all around. They lost 1 infantry in the capturing of Ukraine. And so that's their total losses this time. The Axis lost 6. The Allies lose only 3 this time. For non-combat, they decide to evacuate West Russia, which I think was an interesting choice. They there's going to be a correction here. I have the AA gun being left behind. It's actually an infantry. We'll have a new picture for that here in just a minute. Mobilized, they've got their 6 infantry, their 2 artillery. They put the 2 infantry, the 2 artillery into Caucasus, and the remaining 4 into Moscow. Doug, what do you think?
I feel like this is a little bit of a confusing move. I don't like the reach out into Ukraine and Belarusia with so many forces, putting them on the front, but then also coupled with withdrawing from West Russia. It seems like you're literally going in opposite directions, and you grabbed a territory that's worth 2, but you've put 10 IPCs worth of stuff out there on the front. You know, the 2 infantry and the artillery in 2 different territories to get destroyed. I just don't know. I feel like if you have a strong force there to counterattack, to, deter Germany from coming into those territories, that's one thing. But to pull most of your forces back and then send these guys out, it just kind of seems like you're wasting your material and for very little to no gain.
When I look at this and I think about the Russians' move here, a couple of things. First, if you're going to step into Ukraine, you need to do it with a little bit more gusto because it's kind of a trap, right? So what you're hoping here is that the Germans overreach and that they send that giant stack into West Russia so that you can close in around them as a kind of a pincer move. But they don't have enough forces in Belarus and Ukraine, or really in Russia, to do that. If the Germans want to step into West Russia, they can get there with a considerable number of units. I don't think it's the right move on Germany to do that, but they certainly have the manpower to do it. Or at a minimum, what you could do is you could take West Russia, take Ukraine, and then blitz all of the tanks through and land them all in Ukraine so that you're a shoo-in to walk into Caucasus on the following turn. So there's just a couple of interesting options there, but the money is certainly important to the Russians, but I don't know that I would have sent the artillery. And this is really where they're suffering from the loss of the fighter, right? So this is why I like the Russian fighters, right? Is so that you can go out there with some cheap infantry, use the fighters to pick off the one guy that you need to take the territory, and then move back. Anyway, moving on to Germany 2. So Germany, starting Germany 2 with 44 IPCs. What is your thinking here as you get started?
Obviously, we are going to want to retake pretty much everything that Germany originally had. Then Africa is going to be our target, with them kind of evacuating Egypt. And finally, there needs to be some kind of defensive plan in case or when Britain is going to come into Europe. So that was kind of the thoughts going into the purchase and the combat move.
So you bought 4 infantry, 2 tanks, and 2 fighters. And here's the correction. We had an infantry there instead of the artillery, the AA gun rather. The AA gun is in Moscow, not in West Russia. Thank you for your patience. Moving on to their combat moves, they turn and come back to Egypt and take that with the infantry, the artillery, and the tank. I'm making a move at the African dollars. Over into the Eastern Front, they send 2 guys, 2 fighters into West Russia, 2 guys, 2 fighters into Belarusia, and then 2 infantry, one from Poland, 1 from Bulgaria. And then they make an offshore bombardment and an amphibious assault with an infantry and the artillery that came from the African theater out of the Black Sea and into Ukraine, along with the fighter and the bomber there. It's a lot of guys facing the infantry and the artillery that are there. I like it. How did it turn out? Well, of course, they were successful in Egypt because there was no resistance, and it seemed like there was very little resistance in the Eastern Theater as well. They did lose an infantry in West Russia, another in Belarus, but it looks like everyone survived in the attack on Ukraine. All in, looks like it was a pretty good round of combat. Russia losing 17, the Germans losing 6. For non-combat, we've got some air units that need to land, and we need to rearrange some stuff. So 2 fighters head back to Karelia. The rest, and along with the bomber, head back to Berlin and land there. The tanks move into Karelia. The infantry move up to Baltic states. When we get it all in place, the stack in Karelia is looking particularly froggy at this point. It looks like you've got 9 tanks up there and 8 infantry along with the 2 fighters, 6 more infantry on the way. Pretty healthy stack. And then, of course, lots of air power that is hanging out in Berlin, eyeing ever so carefully the units that are in C Zone 8. When we mobilize, we've got the 4 infantry, the 2 tanks, and the 2 fighters. The 2 tanks land in Karelia, everybody else into Berlin. Again, unfortunately, still nobody in Italy. We'll see how that plays out. In the end, they've got 6 infantry there, 3 AA guns have landed in Berlin, and then now 5 fighters and the bomber. Looking across the Germans' turn, Doug, what do you think about how that went?
I think it went well for Germany. I don't know that I would have pulled the guys out of Africa to hit Ukraine. I mean, we'll see how that progresses in latter turns, just because there's not really anybody to, unless you take those guys right back down south. You're kind of thin on troops down there. But yeah, other than that, I think it looks pretty solid. One other small tweak is I might have placed 2 infantry in Karelia and the tanks in Berlin, because if you're going to do a Russia push, those tanks can drive up there, on round 3, and you just have the 2 extra guys there. Whereas building the tanks up there, it doesn't allow you the flexibility of using the infantry there. And it also, if I don't think you're too worried about a couple troops landing in France because you have plenty of air power, but it just gives you a little more versatility with those tanks, and I think they can get to Russia in plenty of time. So I might would have put the men in Karelia and the tanks in Germany. But I think overall it's looking. So, oh, and one other thing, I would have just moved the AA up to Karelia if Britain decides to try to go for that victory city. I don't know that you need 3 AA in the capital of Germany. But yeah, I mean, you guys are playing great. I think this looks really solid. I'd feel pretty good if I'm the German player right now.
Yeah, me too. I will say I'm not as worried about the African theater as you are, but the only thing that I would have done differently is I'd have taken Archangel. You've certainly had enough material to do it, and then they immediately have to start worrying about taking Archangel back, so that they can wall off that massive column of tanks and the air units that can reach Moscow. So anytime that you can create an opening for a capital, I think is always important. Plus, it creates an opportunity for a tank to run around through Evenki or Vologda and then maybe into Sinkang, and can really do some pretty significant economic damage pretty quickly. But all in all, I think this is really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back at it, Archangel was definitely a mistake. I'm sure we had a reason for it at the time of why we didn't go for it, but it would have been nice, right? Just looking at the board, that if we had that, being able to blitz in economically or have the access to the capital. I think the only reason we did the infantry in Berlin instead of in Karelia is that we figured they were going to go for France or Northwestern Europe in some way. And the idea was, while infantry would be great, we would rather have those tanks participate against Moscow. And we moved all of the Air Force, or a lot of the Air Force, back to Germany. And so just having that cannon fodder while allowing our tanks to eventually participate in the offensive on Moscow seemed better at the time. And I mean, we'll see how it works out. But that seemed better at the time as far as where we were putting our important units.
Over to the UK, it is time for them to make their purchases. They start with 2 tanks, an artillery, 3 infantry, and 1 fighter this time. On to their combat moves. They do bring both transports over this time. They want to take Northwestern Europe and France, but they take them both with a tank and an infantry. I'm not sure that I would have dropped the tanks here. They're certainly going to get destroyed. You don't need to drop the tanks. You don't need to drop 12 IPCs worth of stuff. You're not going to get that money back. So I think I probably would have just dropped the infantry here to do that job. But this is what they did, and they were successful. And this was their only combat back, so they were able to take that. Oh, they also did step into Transjordan and pick up that territory, which again closes the Suez Canal. For their non-combat, they brought both guys together in Rhodesia. They moved 2 guys over into Persia, landed the fighters, of course, in Sea Zone 8. And the bomber took the long flight from eastern Canada all the way around over to Moscow. Mobilized the new units. They've got the 3 infantry and the artillery going into London, which should fill the 2 transports that they have there. So that's an optimal situation. In India, they got the 2 tanks and a fighter. Again, pretty good purchase for India here when you're going to try to make a move in this direction. Again, though, I'm not sure that I like the split focus, but we'll see. Doug, any thoughts on UK's turn here?
Yeah, I don't love it. I would have taken France with 1 infantry. I would not have taken the tanks over. I wouldn't even taken Northwestern Europe. I don't know what it does. It's not stopping airplanes from landing. I mean, I guess it is stopping 2 airplanes from landing, but I think you could have, if you would have not taken over the 2 armor and the infantry, you could have added another transport to your stack in the Atlantic. And I think you would have maybe had 3 transports and 5 units to transport, but that's not like terribly suboptimal, because sometimes you have to do that with Britain in that theater. You could have also changed your buy. I mean, I'm fine with the 2 tanks and the fighter in India. But yeah, I don't really like what they're doing, because they're just not adding any pressure. They're just wasting land units. They're going to get shredded by the infantry in the air probably, and they're not really cranking up the pressure. So I don't really love what's going on with Britain right now.
Over to Japan. They bought a carrier, 2 destroyers, and an artillery.
Well, we saw their whole entire fleet coming towards us. You talked earlier about the cruiser coming up, and it's a clear sign of where they're going. So me and him talked immediately when they were doing their turn, and we were like, a carrier needs to happen. The Japan fleet needs to get stronger, or else we're going to lose this game. So that's why we were like, we're just going to dive in on the fleet. And we had some extra IPC, so why not buy a little artillery guy?
Well, I mean, and you've already got the extra fighters to land on this carrier. So you honestly, you probably could have bought 2 carriers here and had enough air units to land.
I think you'll see in a second why we did the destroyers, because we had a strategy, which I'm going to let Alex explain because he does it better than me, with destroyers to counter the Pacific threat. And the destroyers actually made a big impact for us, even though another carrier, you're right, would have been great, would have probably, obviously add some defense power or attack power. But I think these destroyers are kind of what made Japan great, actually.
Okay, well, let's find out. So onto the combat moves. You splintered up into the north to take Yakut and the Soviet Far East. You stepped west into Xinjiang and Sichuan. I don't know why you didn't take Burma, but you didn't. But what you did do is you sent 2 bombers off of Japan to attack the land units in Iwo Jima. I think this was a very, very smart choice. And what this tells me is that you watched our videos from last year and your opponents did not. Because this is something that we covered quite a bit when we discussed the Thorpe Thump in the 2023 World Championship videos. So I was a little surprised when I saw this position. I happened to be walking by the table when this happened and saw that these 2 guys were on this island next to the only transport in the Pacific Theater for the Americans. So I think this was a really, really smart choice. Let's see how it all played out. You were able to take out both of the American infantry without losing one of your bombers. And even if you had lost one or even both of the bombers, it would have absolutely been worth it, because without the land units to capture victory cities, the American fleet can't really do very much here. So they can have sea dominance all they want, but if they don't have any guys to land, it doesn't really matter.
You took it. That's basically our whole thought process. We were talking, being like, all right, what's our next move? What should we do? What's the thought process here? And then, like, while Alex was talking, I looked at the board. I'm like, we could just bomb Iwo Jima, right? Like, we can just do that, and then they can't do anything. And like, he stopped talking for a second and goes, that's brilliant. Let's just dive into that right now. And I mean, don't get me wrong. If you look at the video, it is 4 rounds of combat. We didn't get them on the first roll, the second roll, the third roll. We rolled 2 4s on the fourth roll of that. So it was incredibly unlucky. But we got them at the end, but they should have at least killed one during that.
For non-combat, you moved the 2 bombers back to Tokyo, the 2 fighters from Kiangsu into Season 62, which will put give a home for the carrier. Everything else consolidates in C-Zone 61 and in Yunnan. You've got a pretty healthy stack in Yunnan right now and a pretty sizable fleet in 61. You dropped a destroyer in 60 as a blocker, just to make it all that much harder if the Americans did decide to get froggy with that fleet that's in 59. When we mobilize our units, the carrier and the 2 destroyers are landing in 62, and of course the artillery into Tokyo. Boy, the Americans have got a lot of material out there, but they don't have a lot to do with it. Let's see what they opt to do on US2. They purchase 4 destroyers and 1 transport.
That confused us completely. We were completely cut off by that. We were just like, what? You just lost your whole attacking force. Like, yeah, you have some guys coming over, but I feel like we both were just like, I feel like you need transports and infantry here. You have a big enough fleet. Maybe a couple destroyers. You don't need that many.
We'll see what they do. So for combat, they decide to go after the destroyer that is your blocker in C-Zone 60. They send a sub and 3 air units. That is all of their combat. They are successful in taking out that destroyer, and the sub survived. So for non-combat, they bring everything together into C-Zone 59. The bomber is still in Midway, but there's a guy there. So they opt to go get that guy off of Midway and load him up on that transport and bring him and drop him in Iwo Jima.
Oh, God. We saw this, and it's like a cartoon when we just look at each other and then we look back at the board and we're like, all right, our plan doesn't change.
Yeah, this is baffling to me. So first, let me say that tournament play is challenging. And this game happened on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock after 3 days of high-level Axis and Allies play at Gen Con, which is a very challenging place to play. And it's a lot of fun, and I recommend people come if you're able and you're interested, but it is a place where mistakes like this can happen because people are tired or they miss where a thing happened, and it's a challenging environment to play in. So occasionally you do have incidents like this that do happen. That is going to make it very hard. Assuming that the Japanese are successful at attacking it again, I like their chances. That's going to be a problem for the Americans. So when we look across the entirety of the map, Doug, what do you think about the situation here?
Where do I start? I mean, yeah, you've already pointed out they're repeating the error that they made with Iwo Jima. I mean, if they'd moved 6 infantry there, maybe, but moving 1 infantry there is ill-advised.
Hey gang, Future Gary here. As you know, we go to great lengths to try to bring you high-level board game action. Still, sometimes even really good players can have a bad game, and that's kind of what happened here. The Allied players started out with a good plan, but they made a few bad moves and fell into some quicksand, leaving an opening for these 2 young, skilled players. Now, after the loss of the land units in Iwo Jima for the second time, the Allied players saw that to win, they were going to need to push as hard as they possibly could and get lucky to even have a chance of winning. What came next is a reflection of that kind of desperation mindset. So rather than spending an hour taking everyone through that, I'm going to step on the gas and give you the highlights of the next 2 rounds over just a couple of minutes. But we're going to come back to our discussion with everybody at the very end of the game because there's some really interesting things that happen there that we want to talk about. So here we go. On Russia 3, they bought another stack of guys and made soft pushes into West Russia and Ukraine, and then stacked into Moscow. At the end of Russia 3, they still had a buffer between them and that German stack in Karelia. On their third turn, the Germans run roughshod through Africa, and they had no trouble taking Paris and northwestern Europe back, and they're beginning to eye that fleet in C-Zone 8. And of course, the stack in Karelia has just gotten stackier. It's now 14 tanks and a bunch of guys. Let's see what the UK wants to do on their third turn. They swing around into the Med to take out the battleship and attack Algeria, putting them in position to threaten Rome and Paris at the same time. They make a couple of other small battles, Egypt, French Indochina, Thailand, and are successful all around. Over to Japan for their third turn. They buy 4 destroyers, pick up some free territory in their western front, and then take a step into Burma. Oh, and they send the 2 bombers out to take out that one lone American in Iwo Jima, as well as pick off the sub that's in C-Zone 60. They are also successful all around. They did lose 1 infantry in Burma. After mobilization, we can see that they've consolidated completely into C-Zone 62 with the exception of a blocker in C-Zone 60. The Americans are knocking on the doorstep, but they didn't bring any gifts for the party. Over to the Americans, they decide now it's time to buy transports. Well, we'll see how that works out. And probably their best move of the game, they send 2 air units to take out the Japanese infantry in Burma, opening up a path for the UK tanks to come from India through Burma and attack the guy in Yunnan. They are successful all around. For non-combat, they split their fleet, putting destroyers into C-Zone 60 and 61, temporarily hemming in the Japanese fleet. They put a big stack in C-Zone 48 to try to secure that C-Zone, and they moved the cruiser and the destroyers down with the lone transport and the 2 land units into C-Zone 44. And for reasons passing understanding, they mobilized one of the transports and the guy in the artillery in the Atlantic Theater. I guess they're hoping that they'll be able to make some last-ditch attempt with the Americans on their last turn, but we'll see how that plays out for them. At the end of round 3, we can see that the UK fleet is in the Med, which takes it out of range of Berlin, takes it out of range of Karelia, and there are a lot of air units that could get there. This is not a great spot for them to be. We can see that the Americans might have a chance of taking Manila here, but they're not going to have an opportunity to hold it. While the Russians are making some additional money in West Russia and Ukraine, they've lost all of the income coming from the eastern side, and they need to shore up. When we look at the victory city tally, it's the same as it was at the end of round 2, 7-6. The Axis are still in the lead, holding Karelia. Back to the Russians for turn 4. They buy another stack of guys, and then for combat, they make what's usually referred to as a Russian breakout here. They make a light attack into all of their surrounding territories to give them some space, and in every one of these battles, they've got some overwhelming odds. Unfortunately, they missed in 3 of those battles and lost just a ton of units here, which is just pretty unfortunate for them. And most importantly, they failed to take Archangel, which leaves them vulnerable to that giant column of tanks that's sitting in Karelia with some additional air units that might be able to come in and help out. Not a great turn for the Russians. After mobilizing, they've got a reasonable stack of low-value units in the territory, but we'll see what happens next. The Germans put a couple more bombers in the air, and I don't blame them. Rather than pushing at Russia, where their math was questionable, they decided to play it a little bit safer, move into West Russia heavy, and take out a couple of the other units, knowing that the giant stack of infantry that they bought on turn 1 would finally be making it to Moscow on turn 5. They were successful, except for a mighty heroic Russian artillery in Belarus that fended off an enormous number of units. For non-combat, they landed their air units in the most logical places, but then they also made Paris untakeable for the UK. Speaking of the UK, for their 4th turn, they decide that it's time to buy some transports, 3 infantry and a tank. For combat, they decide to use the Burma Road that the Americans opened for them so that they can spring out to Yunnan with the help of the bomber. The UK decided to use one of its transports to move an infantry and an artillery into Rome. They do get to take it because it was unoccupied, and I'm sure they'll get to try the spaghetti before the Germans come and clear their plates. They were successful in taking Yunnan, and they put a couple of extra guys into Burma during non-combat. And they continue to play cat and mouse with the Germans in Africa. For non-combat, they bring the fleet out of C-Zone 14, bring it back around to C-Zone 8, but you'll notice that the fighters are missing there because they all flew to Moscow, including the 2 that were in India. So they're all in Moscow now with the bomber. You'll notice that that fleet in C-Zone 8 is looking awfully juicy at this point. There's only 5 units there, plus the battleship taking 2 hits, and there's at least 9, maybe 10 air units that the Germans can get there if they decide to sink that fleet. So this is kind of a risky move for the UK. They mobilized everything, including 3 new transports that would make that target even juicier, into C-Zone 8. So we'll see what the Germans decide to do with that when it comes around to their turn. One upside for the UK's turn here is they get the 4 fighters and the bomber into Moscow to bolster that critical space at least a little bit. Over to the Japanese, they are about to bring the pain. They bring 3 bombers and a sub. For combat, they decided to step into Vologda to pick up that free property, which is always nice. And then they decided to dispatch the troops that are in Yunnan with prejudice, along with the 2 destroyers that were in C-Zone 60 and 61. So those are all gone now. And it only cost them 2 infantry to do all of that. So a pretty good round for the Japanese. They've stacked in Sea Zone 61, which puts them right on the doorstep of Manila. They've got 3 transports there, plus a bunch of guys still in Yunnan. So this is a pretty strong position for the Japanese. After they mobilize, we can see that it gets even stronger with now 5 bombers sitting in Tokyo, along with 2 fighters, a couple of subs there. So it definitely looks like the Japanese are in the catbird seat at the end of their 4th turn. But let's get back to the guys for the U.S.'s 4th turn and see how this game plays out. They start by purchasing 3 bombers. For their combat move, they decided to make the run at the entire Japanese fleet in Sea Zone 62, bringing everything that can reach. Behind them, they brought the transport with the 2 guys, the artillery and the infantry, to successfully take Manila and hopefully be able to hang on to it as the game progresses. We put it all over onto the battle board, and yes, this was another opportunity to show you that this is a signed board. This is Larry Harris's autograph here. Larry Harris is the creator of Axis and Allies. It went to one of our new lieutenants, actually, that has joined the Board Game Nation citizenry, and he is actually just outside of Frankfurt, Germany. So this one is actually on its way right now to Frankfurt, Germany. So thank you for being a member. All right, so when we look at the math for this battle, just looking at it, it doesn't look great. When we run the calculator, it turns out that this battle shows a 25%, just under 25% probability of success in the attack. Not a great number that you're hoping to find when you've kind of got the game on the line. Let's see how it worked out for them. Oof. Not so much. This did not go well for them. They lost all of the units they brought into the battle, taking out 5 destroyers and losing their entire fleet. This was not a great outcome for them. And when you look at what they've got left, holy cow, it even looks even more daunting. When you look at the non-combat moves, the Americans brought the cruiser and the 4 destroyers forward into Sea Zone 48 to try to stand up to the massive Japanese armada that still sits in 62, plus the 5 bombers that are sitting in Japan with the 2 fighters that are there, plus the 2 subs. They did also bring down the destroyer and the 3 transports into 44. Unfortunately, those units are now in range of a lot of Japanese air power, so even those units are not going to be safe. You are safe nowhere in the Pacific when the Japanese have got that many air units and carriers. They brought the transport forward to Sea Zone 10 and landed in eastern Canada with the hopes of heading towards France at some point in the future. They mobilized the 3 bombers into San Francisco and then resigned. They were looking at the Japanese fleet coming back and taking Manila. They were looking at them taking Calcutta. They could not stand up against the Germans that are likely to move into Russia. And they really did not have any substantial hope of taking Paris with the land units that they had available, even if that fleet were to somehow survive the almost certain impending air attack that's going to be coming from the Germans. Any thoughts about how this played out, gentlemen?
It's not often, I feel like, that you take 2 victory cities and then resign. I think it just kind of goes to show we were in that defensive position, forcing them to make that mistake, right? Did we have other moves that could have won us the game earlier? I think absolutely. We've seen that throughout this review and going through this. But by doing what we did, we put them in a position that it was kind of hopeless at the end.
I loved this game. I don't think we made perfect moves. I think we did everything that we did that was in front of us. I do like that throughout you guys were just like, you could have done this, you could have done that, which we could have probably won the game earlier in some instances. But I feel like from what we talked about days before about how we wanted to do this and play really defensive, especially where Japan was our main focus, we did almost everything correct there. We once again put America in an unwinnable state.
So with the Allies' resignation, that brings this game to a close. I feel like this was a really interesting game. I feel like there were some really good moves that were made. I feel like there were some mistakes that were made. But I think that it was an interesting game either way. Congratulations, Alex, Owen. You guys played really, really well. And I hope that you had a good time at your very first Axis and Allies tournament. Congratulations, guys.
Thank you so much. I would recommend it to anybody to go to Gen Con, try it out. It was a blast. We didn't see enough of it, and thank y'all for having us.
Yeah, it was awesome. This has been an awesome experience throughout. I mean, we're going to Gen Con again next year, and I think we're signing up for the anniversary edition. We're going one level higher to see if we can handle it.
Yeah, congrats, guys. Well played game throughout. A lot of really slick moves, tactically and strategically overall in the big picture. So, congratulations.
Guys, thanks again for taking the time and walking us through this incredible game. We can't wait to see you next year at Gen Con.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing y'all.
Thank you guys very much.
All right, Doug. Well, we've got through the final of the 1942 second edition at Gen Con 2024. I thought it was a really good game. I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us. We can't wait till next time where we talk about the game that you played in the World Championship, and we're going to talk about anniversary. We've got a bunch of events to cover, and Doug's going to be here with me for all of it. We can't wait. Doug, thanks again for taking the time.
Yeah, looking forward to it, the future ones, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this. This was a lot of fun. It was great to see some new players win, and just hopefully keep growing Access and Allies and tournament attendance.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Thank you for watching the first video in our coverage of the 2024 Axis and Allies World Championship. We hope that you'll be back for our live stream on the Friday following the publishing of this video. They are always a lot of fun. Congratulations again to Alex and Owen on their victory, and thanks to Doug for being here. Next time, we'll be jumping into the quarterfinal action of the World Championship event featuring the Anniversary Edition. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell to get notified when that's ready. And if you want loads of exclusive content, including extras and deleted scenes from this very game, click the join button to find the membership level that's right for you and become part of our fast-growing community. When the World Championship quarterfinal is ready, you'll find it right here. When the live stream that followed the premiere of this video is ready, it'll be here. For our latest bit of mayhem, right this way. And if you're ready for more from Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.